So, a couple things to go over. So I got a number of emails of people wanting some clarification on modus ponens, modus tollens, affirming the consequent, denying the antecedent. So let's do that now as prep for the test. One question I got was, what's the difference between these two? And it's, I think it's fairly, you'll be able to see the difference if you just look at the parts of the, so the first line is always if P then Q, so it's a conditional of some sort. And the question is, what do you do with the conditional? It might be helpful, and then these are the two fallacies, it might be helpful to just look at them all as a group. So there's four things you can do with a conditional, right? There's two parts of the conditional, the antecedent and the consequent, and you can do four things. You can either say the antecedent is true, up here, or you could say it's false. You could say the consequent is true, or it's false, right? And two of those are really good arguments, and two of them are really bad. So if you can just sort of sort out which is which, you're in good shape, right? So this one, if P then Q, P therefore Q. So just remember what the conditional says. So the conditional says anytime the first part is true, the second part has to be true as well. So if the conditional is true, you know that given the first part, the second part follows. So this is a good one, right? This one's modus ponens. Yeah? Okay. Now what about this one? So if P then Q, we know that the antecedent is false. Can we therefore conclude that the consequent is false? Yeah. No. Because just because you know that if P is true, then Q has also got to be true. That's right. It doesn't mean that if P fails to be true, then Q is always going to fail to be true. So you can fill these out with examples. Fill them out with your favorite example. For example, if it's raining, then the sidewalks are wet. So if it's raining, then the sidewalks are wet. P is it's raining. Q is the sidewalks are wet. It's not raining, therefore the sidewalks are not wet. Well, today that's false, right? It's not raining, but the sidewalks are covered in wet slush. Right? So, but it's true that if it's raining, then the sidewalks are wet. So that conditional is true. It can be true that the negation of the antecedent is true, but the negation of the consequent is not true. So they name these things. This is one of the fallacies. So this is a good one. This is good old modus ponens. This is one of the fallacies, one of the invalid argument forms. We name it after the second premise. So we're denying the antecedent. Denying the antecedent is the name of this thing. So the name of this fallacy is given by which part of the conditional you're doing what to. So you're denying the antecedent. And that's bad. Don't do that. I have very few traditional philosophy things that I'm keen to get you to learn in this course, but this is one of them. If you leave my course and still think denying the antecedent is a good argument, I will fail you all. So, okay, so this is a good one, modus ponens. But if you just deny P, that doesn't give you that Q is false. Okay, if P then Q, Q, therefore P. If it's raining, then the sidewalks are wet. The sidewalks are wet, therefore it's raining. Again, just having been outside today should show you that that doesn't work, right? Right? Okay, so that's also a fallacy. So just asserting that the consequent is true doesn't mean that the antecedent is true. These conditionals are one-way inferences. That's the thing. That's the thing to keep in mind. Getting P gives you Q, but getting Q doesn't give you P, just from having this conditional be true. So this is another fallacy, and what we've done is affirmed the consequent. Right. You said that the consequent is true, and derive from that the antecedent is true. That's no good. That just leaves our one last one, which I told you that two of these are good and two of these are bad, so process of elimination, this is one of the good ones. If it's raining, then the sidewalks are wet, but the sidewalks aren't wet, so you know it's not raining. So if those first two things are true, then that third thing's just gotta be true, right? And if it turns out that raining doesn't always make the sidewalks wet, then that first conditional is false, right? So it's a valid argument form when we assume the premises are true, then the conclusion follows. Okay, so this is the pattern, right? There's 4 things that you can do. The conditional's got 2 parts. You could either say the first part is true, first part is false. You say the second part is true, the second part is false. Okay, so yeah, a number of people were sort of looking at these and maybe not seeing the difference between them. Hopefully having them all sort of arranged systematically shows you the pattern of differences. Does that help at all? Yeah, okay, okay, good. Okay, yeah, so there's not going to be too many, I mean, I think there's 1 or 2 points that are correlated to this stuff on the test. There's not a whole lot of it, but it is important to get this stuff so that when you're doing your argument analyses, you can treat these properly. So, modus ponens is this thing, modus tollens is this thing, affirming the consequent. Sorry, this is, yes, affirming the consequent and denying the antecedent. Partly also why I wanted to teach you the names of the parts of the conditional so that you could remember the names of these 2 fallacies. Okay. Is that all right? Okay. Right. A few people also emailed me about this thing, which is just a mistake that I made. I put this thing on the list of key course terms, but didn't teach it to you. So yes, if you saw this and you're like, oh my God, I can't remember what this was, sorry, that was me. Let me teach this to you now. It won't be on the test, however. So yeah. So disjunctive syllogism. Okay, so a disjunction is a kind of or statement. An and statement is a conjunction, or statement is a disjunction. And so, for example, either my dog is sick or she's just lazy, right? It's either this or that. Yeah?
Are we using inclusive or exclusive or in this class?
So, good question. Good question. So in this class, we don't actually have a rule about that. So just to explain, if you haven't heard of inclusive and exclusive disjunctions, if the waiter says, you can have fries or salad, and you say, yes, I'd like both, please, then you're confused, because they said they want you to pick one or the other. If one's true, the other's got to be false. So that's an exclusive disjunction. Inclusive disjunction, maybe the dog is lazy and sick. I mean, those could both be true at the same time. Inclusive disjunction. So in symbolic logic, they pick one or the other. Usually they do inclusive disjunction. For our purposes, because we're dealing with natural language, usually natural language doesn't actually specify which of those you mean. If you say either or, that tells you it's exclusive. But if you just see or, you might not know which of the two it is. So we're not going to insist on one or the other because natural language doesn't insist on one or the other. And the inference that I want to show you right now, the disjunctive syllogism, actually works with either. So if I say either my dog is sick or she's just lazy, and I know that she's not sick, then you conclude from that she is lazy. Right? So disjunctive syllogism takes one of these or statements and says we know that one of parts of that or statement is false, and that's going to be a valid inference to get you. By knowing one half of it is false, you get that the other half is true. And that's going to work for either inclusive or exclusive disjunctions. Yeah? Okay, so that's disjunctive syllogism. It's another argument form. I wanted to show you this because it's another argument form that can enter into, sorry, there's the kind of like schematic of it, just the purely formal version, x or y, and you know not x, and you can conclude y. So this is one more thing that can enter into a dependent relationship. Yeah? So far we've done, the only dependent relations we've done are categoricals, conditionals, and chain reasoning. So here's one more thing that can fit that. So if you've got x or y and you've got not x, then you can conclude y. But for example, if I don't have that it's true that either this or that, and you know that your dog is not sick, that doesn't mean that she's lazy, right? If all I know is my dog's not sick, you can't infer from that your dog is lazy. That just doesn't work, right? And if you don't have that she's not sick, you also can't conclude that she is lazy. Yeah, so you need both of those to be true to get the conclusion, right? Yeah?
Would you ever add one of these as a missing premise? Like if you were given an argument where it says like among the premises, like one was just like she is not sick and the conclusion is she is lazy, could you add like either my dog is sick or lazy as a missing premise?
Yeah, one could. I won't do that on this test, but that is a potential missing premise. So because it enters into a dependent relationship, it's potentially a missing premise. So you might say, either you're for us or against us, therefore you're against us. Well, there's a missing premise in there that one half of that is false, right? Right? Or if you just do, you're not for us, therefore you're against us, the missing premise is this disjunction. So either it's this or that. We'll come around to talk about this when we talk about false dichotomies. It's a kind of fallacy that people sometimes make, where they offer you two things as possibilities and say, you got to pick one of these two, but actually there's totally other possibilities. So we'll come back around to that. Yeah. Okay. So that's what that was, in case you were curious. Again, it's not on test 1. Good? Reasonably okay? Okay. We're at the stage of the semester now where I'm not going to get much enthusiasm from you on anything, I understand. One more week till reading week. Okay, so just to review, we got now 4 things that can enter into dependent relationships that we've talked about. We've got conditionals, categoricals, disjunctions, and then 2 conditionals that result in another conditional. And that was the stuff about chain reasoning. If x then y, if y then z, therefore if x then z, right? So if I stay up late, then I will sleep in. If I sleep in, then I'll miss class. Therefore, if I stay up late, I will miss class. I think that's fairly intuitive, yeah? But just one more kind of thing that can enter into a dependent relationship. Okay? Okay. Let's talk a little bit more directly about the test. So I want to just go over, I hope if you have been studying, you looked at the practice test. Just want to go over some of the answers and talk about what makes them good answers. So in the definition section, for example, so here's exactly the prompt that you'll get. Define the following terms in a few sentences, explaining their connection with other ideas in the course. And that second part of that might make you a little nervous, so I want to talk about it now. So suppose I gave you the following. Suppose I gave you normative. So I want you to define what it means to be normative and then connect it up with something else in the course. These connections don't have to be like long, elaborate explanations. I just need to show me that you can relate this concept to kind of anything else that we talked about. Describe the relationship with some other concept. It's part of how I test whether you understand what's going on, because it's fairly straightforward to memorize a definition, and I don't want to test your ability to memorize things. I want to be testing whether you've got how all this stuff hangs together as a connected web of concepts. So if you're answering one of these questions, when you're answering one of these questions on Wednesday, start off with a definition. So just tell me what the term means. Normative statements are statements of value. That is, they tell you what's morally right or wrong, or what you ought to do or ought not to do. Okay, that's the definition. One sentence, it's kind of a long sentence. If it takes you 2 or 3 sentences, that's okay. But I'm just telling you, just say what the concept means, yeah? Okay, and then that's worth 1 point. If you get the definition right, you get the point. That's it. And we'll talk about definitions later today, what makes a good definition. So, yeah. And then we connect this to other ideas. So values are things that are important to a person. This is sometimes going to be a good thing to do. So if you use a term from the course in your definition, if you want to be super safe, unpack that term for me. That is, just tell me what the terms mean. Values are things that are important to a person. So I'm just kind of continuing the definition by, I used a term from the course in order to define the term, and then I just demonstrate to me that you know what that term means. Again, what I'm looking for is just evidence that you know what you're talking about, rather than have memorized a sentence. And then finally, values, they are shaped by ethical theories and they shape our goals. So when we talked about normativity, we talked about how values are sort of like justified by ethical theories and how values tell us what goals we should set. So that sentence connects it up with two other ideas that we talked about in that lecture. Yeah? So that's 2 out of 2 points there. I've defined the term. I've even gone so far as to unpack one of the words that I used to define one of the words I used in the definition, and then I connected it up kind of very briefly, but with other ideas from the course. Yeah? So that's a full points answer. Notice that it's not like 3 paragraphs long. You don't need to write extensive. This is not a short essay. Just quickly show me that you know what this stuff means and are able to connect it up with something else. Okay. Just one more example. So same question, missing premises. A missing premise is a premise not stated but intended. I'd say most missing premises are normative premises, that is, things we would normally agree on based on our values. Missing premises are always in a dependent relation with a given premise. So just that first sentence there is the definition. Missing premise is a premise not stated but intended. And then I just say some things about it. This was actually taken from a test. I don't know if most missing premises are normative. Many are, we might say. But they still got full points for it because I'm not trying to be that picky. And missing premises are always in a dependent relation with a given premise. So I'm just connecting up missing premises with this other thing that was on the list of key course terms, which is dependent relation. Yeah? Okay, any questions about those sort of definition styles? Okay, good. Right. Okay, so any other question before we go on to the topic for today? Any other questions about the test? Okay. Good. So, today we're going to talk about, clarifying meaning and to evaluate an argument. So basically after this test, we're going to start talking about evaluating arguments. We're almost done with the argument mapping analyzing section of the course. After this test, we're going to start in the actually saying whether an argument is good or bad. But the very last part of that is trying to clarify what they mean. So this is sort of the turning point between analyzing arguments and evaluating them, clarifying the meaning, and I think the last exercise clearly showed that that's not always super simple. We talked last time in the last lecture about the principle of charity. This is one of the guiding principles that I'd like you to use when you're trying to clarify the meaning of an argument. Try to clarify it in a way, try to analyze these arguments in a way that makes them make maximal sense, right? Be nice to the person that you're talking to. Because again, a real debate where you're exchanging arguments only works if you can find points of agreement. So if you're trying to undermine somebody by disagreeing with everything you can and interpreting them as uncharitably as you can, you're kind of in a fight rather than a debate, right? And you run the risk of the straw man fallacy, which is trying to refute a conclusion that the other person wasn't actually advancing. So they advance a conclusion and you accuse them of advancing a much sillier conclusion. And you're not going to make any progress like that either. So we do the principle of charity because we want to A, maximize agreement, and B, avoid the straw man fallacy, which will just make you look silly and mean, right? Okay. Okay, so that was where we got so far in the clarifying meaning stuff. This time I want to do some stuff on meaning and definitions. Yeah? Just like the meaning of words. Okay, so a definition has the following job. The job of a definition is to kind of draw a circle in the world and say what things in the world are members of a category and what things in the world are not members of the category. So a definition of a triangle is a closed plane figure with exactly 3 straight sides and 3 angles. That's a kind of formula or a rule that you can use. So you can take any object in the universe and ask, does it satisfy those conditions? And if it does, that's a triangle. And if it doesn't, it's not a triangle, right? So this is the best kind of, in geometry they can give really precise definitions. I mean, it's the ideal case where that definition draws a perfectly crisp, clean line around the set of all triangles. All the triangles are inside the circle, all the non-triangles are outside the circle. So it's doing the job of a definition just perfectly. So ideally, and this is an ideal that we kind of rarely achieve, as I'm going to try to argue for you today, we usually don't get definitions that are as nice as that. But ideally, a definition will give you necessary and sufficient conditions. So a necessary condition says, without this condition, you don't get to be a member of the category. So if something doesn't have three sides, having three sides is a necessary condition for something to be a triangle. You don't have three sides, you don't get to be a triangle. And then the whole list of things all together is sufficient. So if you have all the features of a triangle, then you're a triangle. It's enough. To keep necessary and sufficient in my head, straight in my head, I often have to go to this metaphor. This is my go-to metaphor for thinking fire. So oxygen is a necessary condition for fire. No oxygen, you don't get to have a fire, right? But oxygen, fortunately, is not sufficient for having a fire, because there's a lot of oxygen in this room, and if it was sufficient, then we would all be on fire right now. So grateful that oxygen is necessary, but not sufficient for having a fire. So the difference between necessary and sufficient, with necessary is without it, you don't get to have the thing. Sufficient is with it, you do get to have the thing. So I don't know I'm not quite sure what the sufficient conditions for having a fire are. I guess you need oxygen, fuel, a spark. You can't be underwater. You can't be currently being sucked into a black hole. I mean, you might have to, the list might be long to get the sufficient conditions for a fire, because it's got to be that if you've got those things, then there's definitely a fire. The wind can't be 100 kilometers an hour, that kind of thing. Okay, so sufficient conditions are often harder to come by than necessary conditions, but so long as you get the difference, we're good. Okay. So, if anything has three straight sides, is closed, is a plane figure, and has three angles, then it's a triangle. So each one of those things, say, if it has this and this and this and this, each of those individual things are necessary, and jointly they're sufficient. Yeah? Okay, so that's the ideal case. And the problem is that practically none of our definitions actually live up to that ideal. We generally treat them as though they do, and they mostly don't. And especially definitions from the dictionary. I mean, if you look up the dictionary definition of a triangle, you're in safe hands. But for anything, kind of anything except mathematical stuff or logical stuff, I mean, there's necessary and sufficient conditions in computer programming, logic, and math. Sometimes science, sometimes in very clear cases in science there are. But consider the following definition of a chair. Does anybody here not know what a chair is? Hands up if you don't know what a chair is. Great. Okay, so we're all perfectly conversant with chairs. You all feel like if you saw a chair, you could identify it, right? Nobody's confused, nobody's lacking chair knowledge, right? Okay, so how about this definition of a chair? A seat typically having 4 legs and a back for one person. That sound about right to you? That's what the dictionary says, and the dictionary is always right. So, actually, it drives me insane that people go to the dictionary for definitions, because the dictionary does not give you, it doesn't give you necessary and sufficient conditions. The people who write the dictionary don't have some magic window into the structure of concepts that all the rest of us lack. They're doing their best, but a seat typically having 4 legs and a back for one person, that's pretty good, and it gets most of the things that you're interested in chairs, right? But it doesn't get, so here's a few images. So if you do Google image search for chair, there you go. That's a chair, right? Google image search thinks it's a chair, and that it's always right too. So, but it doesn't have 4 legs. So one of the conditions isn't met, right? So is it not a chair? Or is the definition not a set of necessary and sufficient conditions? Yeah.
Definition doesn't include everything you need for a chair.
Yeah. I think typically, a seat typically is doing a lot of work in that definition. So it's not giving you a crisp, so the first definition I showed you of a triangle was this beautifully crisp definition where if anything has those things, that is a triangle, my friend. And if it lacks any one of them, that just ain't a triangle. This one, okay, how about this? It's a chair, right? It's a weird 70s chair, but that's a chair. Has 1 leg. That's a chair. Yeah? That's a chair. Maybe a stool. But when you search Google image search for chairs, that comes up. That's a chair. It's only got 1 leg. It's got no back. It has neither of the features those 3 features, 4 legs, a back, and for one person. The only feature that actually satisfies is that it's for one person. Or 2 very friendly people. Yeah? That's a chair. It's a kneeling chair. Doesn't have a back. They're incredibly uncomfortable. They look like they should be comfortable. I can't spend more than 20 minutes on one of those things. Anyway, but that's a chair, right? Okay, so what? Okay, so the short lesson here is when you go to the dictionary, what they're giving you is a kind of rough and ready set of descriptions that are useful if you're competent with using the language to pick something out. I promise you I didn't go to the dictionary looking for the worst definition. Yeah? Like, trying to define what a chair is. And I don't think I could do better than this either. Like, I'd be interested to know if any of you can think of something that's just a way better definition of a chair that captures all those things, but excludes non-chairs. I'd be curious to hear it. But I don't think there is such a thing. So, and I don't think that this is a special thing about chairs. Yeah? If chair is like this, probably most of our ordinary language concepts are going to be like this. Yeah? So you gotta, it's not like dictionaries are useless, but you gotta be very careful about what they're doing, what they're for. And it's not giving you a precise definition. Because most of our concepts just don't have that. Which would have been a helpful thing for somebody like Plato to have known. So Plato went around thinking that he could sort of pester people into giving him precise definitions of stuff like justice and virtue and knowledge. He thought you could bug people, or sorry, Socrates went around bugging people. Plato just wrote about it. But Socrates thought you could irritate people and ask them questions about their concepts, and they would be able to articulate for you exactly what the necessary and sufficient conditions for those concepts would be. Philosophy's been working on this for a really long time, and I'm sorry to say we do not have necessary and sufficient conditions for any of those. Yeah?
I thought that when Socrates went around asking people to tell him what justice and virtue and so on were, he was trying to prove that they didn't know as much as he said they were when they weren't able to come up with good definitions for that.
That's
Find it out himself.
a slightly so there's 2 ways of reading the dialogues. One which is that he was actually trying to get at the definitions of these things, and one which he was just trying to show people their own ignorance. I think he probably would have been happy with either of those outcomes. But yeah, so there's some. No, that's a fair sort of precisification of the project. But yeah, so the general project was, and has been in philosophy for some millennia now, let's try to come up with precise definitions of the important concepts that sort of structure our lives. And we really haven't been getting that far with the whole thing. Like, we really haven't been nailing any of this stuff down. And maybe it's because philosophers are bad at this. I'll admit that possibility. But there is another possibility. So the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein argues that most of our ordinary concepts just don't have necessary and sufficient conditions. Yeah?
Could it also be because like it's created from a human concept? Like triangles are things that just exist. Like they're shapes that exist where we just put a word to it, and we put words to those things. But because like virtue and justice are more moral and like human societal concepts.
Maybe, yeah. So virtue, justice, and that stuff are sort of, but you get the same problem with, for example, species. So if you try to define exactly what makes a species, we really don't have a definition of that, to be serious. So there's a big debate in biology and philosophy of biology. How do you define a species? Any biologists here? How do you define a species?
It's arbitrary.
Arbitrary, yeah, okay. So we just sort of like, you want to define what are all the Homo sapiens, and you draw some arbitrary line in the quite fuzzy boundaries. So for a very long time, the definition of the species that I was given was two organisms are a member of the same species if they can reproduce together and produce fertile offspring. But then you have us and Neanderthals, who are supposedly different species, and we reproduced and produced fertile offspring. Or there's, running around in southern Ontario, coy wolves, coyotes mixed with wolves mixed with dogs. Supposedly separate species, but they've reproduced and produced fertile offspring. So we don't currently have, there's a bunch of different species concepts in biology, and none of them are like that really good triangle definition. This like picks out all and only the members of the category. So whatever the reasons, here's the claim. Most of our concepts, in formal languages, in languages that actually, so in some way it's the languages that we invent that are the most likely to have precise definitions, because we can sort of say whatever, we just say what the words mean. Here's what I mean by a triangle. But in any natural language, our concepts, at least Wittgenstein claims, just don't have necessary and sufficient conditions. They don't draw, so if we're thinking of a definition as drawing a circle around a category, most of our concepts just don't draw a crisp, clean circle. They've got fuzzy boundaries. They've got unclear boundaries. So what Wittgenstein proposes instead is what you might call family resemblances. So when you have a concept, it's not going to be just one clear circle. It's going to be some overlapping sets of things. So if you look at these little diagrams here, you can see there's no perfect overlap, right? There's overlap between the circles, but there's no point where they all overlap. The family resemblance metaphor is, of course, supposed to be a metaphor for like the literal resemblance between members of a family. So I got my mother's chin and my father's ears. I got eyes that look like my sister, a nose that looks like my brother. But there's no one feature that's shared by every member of our family, right? There's no one defining Lewis feature that you can go, that's it. That's the thing that everybody has, and if you have it, then you're in that category, right? We've got a kind of overlapping set of features, and not everybody has every one of those features, right? Okay, so that's the metaphor, the family resemblance metaphor. So when we're thinking about the features that we include in a definition, Wittgenstein suggests we're much more likely to find something like this pattern than we are a perfectly crisp circle that all the members share and any non-members will fail to share, right? So, okay, for fun, let's do a game. So, again, does anybody not know what a game is? Okay, great. So, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to be a game? Yeah.
It needs rules, it needs players.
It needs rules. What about imagination games, where you're just sort of, I don't know, I play as a lot of times as a kid, I would just sort of, with a couple other people, make stuff up and pretend we're doing stuff. There's not really rules as such. And for players, in game theory, they have what's called zero-player rules, zero-player games, where the game just plays itself, like Conway's Game of Life. Now, that's a weird way of using the word game, but it is a way that people use that word. Yeah? It has to be an activity. Yeah, that's pretty broad. That is pretty broad. But let's put it up. Okay, as a necessary condition. So I can't think of anything as a game that's not an activity. So the zero-player games aren't really, there's nobody there to do it, but I suppose the game itself is performing an activity. Yeah? Yeah?
Something that brings joy, but can also bring consequence.
Something that brings joy. So I would offer you a counterexample of Monopoly, which I'm convinced nobody has ever enjoyed. It's just a joyless black hole of misery.
I have fun.
Okay.
I win.
Why would you lie like that? Stop. Okay, so no, more serious. Sorry, Monopoly fans, I apologize. I just hated it as a game. More seriously, think of war games. So war games are preparation for war, and the point is not to enjoy it at all. And you could have zero enjoyment, and it's still a game in that sense. Yeah.
Counter-argument, warmongers.
Warmongers?
Warmongers.
I don't understand the.
Sure they enjoy the game of war.
Well, no, not the actual war, but they prep for war. Yeah.
Games should have like either a beginning to an end, or if it's like an endless game, it should just still have a beginning.
Okay. Again, so it's either got to have, so it has to have a beginning. I think was the. Okay, yeah, but I think that applies. That's very broad. It's very, very broad. Okay, yeah.
There needs to be an objective.
Does there need to be an objective? Again, playing an imagination game. Kind of, you're just sort of playing it, yeah?
You could argue that the objective is to expect your imagination.
Yeah, I suppose there needs to be an objective. Can the objective change? Does it have to be one objective, or can it be like an ongoing?
Well, sure.
Okay. Can you have an objectiveless game, I guess is the question. A game that's just sort of rolling on without any clear point. Again, Monopoly seems to be just, yeah.
That there's like a set outcome and there's like a level of competition, even if you're just playing against yourself. So like solitaire, there's like a competition to like the point of the game is yourself.
So in that one, I would suggest improv games. So in improv, it's an entirely collaborative, cooperative game. So somebody gives you act out a scene where you're like going to a store, and then the whole point is not to be better at improv. It's actually to help each other.
But also, if you mess up the scene, then I'm not going to say lose. You broke the scene, so you lost. There's still like a sense of like
So
a competition within yourself to not break the scene and to do better each time.
that's. So, sort of, they often sort of, if you watch higher level improv people, they sometimes intentionally try to break the scene because it's funny. They'll try to trip up their fellow improvisers.
But that's competition.
Yeah, sort of.
Even like, I'm not saying like competition in the sense where it's like I need to win, you need to lose, but it's like the outcome is like you're competing, like you're doing something. And most games are like that. Like I can't think of any game where you're not essentially competing, even as a team.
Yeah.
Even like imagination games, like as a kid, like you're doing something.
You're doing something.
Like you're constantly like competing to like there's like a set outcome, even if you don't know what the outcome is, there is an outcome. Like
Okay, so there is an outcome. Unless the game doesn't end.
yeah, but then there's still like set times throughout the game, even if it's like a never ending game. Like then like war, you like the just the quick guard game.
Oh.
It can keep going. It's like there are set times where if you just cut it off right here, this person won, this person lost. But it can just keep going. There's an outcome.
Okay, there is an outcome. Sorry, hands up here.
I was just gonna say like two things. Just building off of that, you might say that there's no like if the game doesn't end, then there might not be a final outcome, but like there can be like stepped outcomes for. So for her example of war, like each time you play the card or whatever, there's an outcome to that action. So even if you're not talking about like a final action, there are still outcomes throughout
So
it.
there's an outcome or there's a state of the game. Is the idea?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
And then the only other question I was going to ask is, are definitions ever subjective? Like we see, like you're defining like imaginary games as games, but I don't know if I would necessarily define that as a game. So
Right.
Could that type of thing be subjective? And then based on that, like, because you're making judgments about what things can be included in the definition based on your definition of the game.
So anything that people commonly call a game is what I'm working with. Yeah.
Should games have like a reason to like, what's the reason of Monopoly to like own the most land, and like if it was a drawing game, what's the reason to it? If it is to like guess the person's drawing, so I guess having a reason.
So again, the 0-player games, I don't think that they have anything that they're aimed at.
Then the question is, why are you playing this first?
Kind of just to see what it does, actually. Yeah. Sorry, I know I'm doing weird, frustrating stuff right now, but it's kind of the point. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it's always like a fantasy or representation of something else. You know, like preparing for war. There's like a war game, but you wouldn't call actual war a game.
Is all games preparing for something? Like if you're playing chess, are you preparing to do anything but play chess?
No, that's
Okay. Yeah.
I feel like there's a purpose to every single game. Like even in the game of life, it's supposed to teach you like how to live and how things like there's risks in life and stuff like that.
Yeah. So the game of life is an interesting one. I wish I had the moral fortitude to enjoy that game. And I think with the lesson of the game of life is that it's kind of arbitrary what happens, and it's a little bit boring, but really it's about hanging out with people. That's my moral lesson from the game of life. So, yeah. So there's a purpose. Is that the idea? Yeah. Okay. So several people have said purpose. So we'll put it up there. Yeah. Yeah.
I just think another way of saying that would be that there's a motive.
Yeah. Purpose or motive. Yeah. Good. Yeah. Yeah.
What about premise or idea?
What about which?
Premise or idea?
There's a premise or an idea. So there's an idea. Okay, so pretty good for necessary conditions. So the test on Wednesday by this is a game because it's an activity with a beginning. We'll start right at 10. There's an outcome or a state. There's definitely a purpose. You got motivation, and there's an idea behind it. War is a game here. Divorce is a game. So, okay, so even if you get necessary conditions, it's really hard to get. So what we've done here is we've got some necessary conditions by being very, very broad, right? Very inclusive. And so there's two things that a definition needs to do. It needs to include all of the members, but exclude things that you don't consider a game, right? So, I mean, okay, so I've done this game with a number of classes, and I've never come up with anything that looks to me like a definition of game. Yeah.
Are you supposed to like define it broadly, but then also exclude it in the definition?
Well, you're supposed to exclude things that aren't games. Yeah. I would propose to you that the test on Wednesday is not a game. Right? It's not fun. You're not doing it for the joy or anything like that. It's an activity with a beginning, an outcome, and a purpose, and then there's an idea behind it. But it's not a game. Lots of things aren't games, right? Yeah.
Well, then in that case, can you add brings fun/joy to our definition?
But again, I think there are things that are games that don't count as having joy.
But I think that's very subjective. Because like I have fun while playing Monopoly.
Yes.
So it brings me joy.
So, but war games are an example of something that's a kind of game, but is not about having fun.
I think calling like a war game, like something that actually prepares you for war, calling it a game is very. I don't.
It's got game right in the name of it.
Yeah, but like I don't think like Call of Duty to prepare, and I know other people use that for like fun, but like it's training. I don't think it's a game. They just call it game to loosen the blow of anything. Like.
Okay, so that's totally fair.
Yeah.
And a few other people have been moving in that same direction. Like, no, that's not a game. Like these 0-player games, that's not a game. What if we have, instead of a definition, we have something like this? What we have are a bunch of semi-overlapping uses of the word game. So a 0-player game's got some of the features of a game, like it's got a state, it's got some rules, it's got some outcomes. A war game has got some of the features of what you might think of as a game. Monopoly's got some of them, imagination games or improv games. What if we're just using the same word in a variety of only semi-overlapping ways? So this is sort of Wittgenstein's argument for concepts not having this kind of really crisp centralized structure in the way that, for example, the definition of a triangle has this really crisp, here's all the members, here's all the non-members. If you have these features, you're in. If you don't have them all, you're out. Maybe games just not like that. So that when we have if somebody says, yeah, that's not really a game, what they're saying is, I care more about the blue circle than the red circle. Yeah? Something like that. Okay. I don't know if that's convincing to you for this picture of how definitions work. For me, the most convincing argument is the thousands of years of philosophy where we've tried really hard to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions and just failed and failed and failed and failed. Yeah.
So for like, the example of game, if it has at least one of those features, it would be considered a game, considered like a single player game?
I mean, it's not clear to me. So I don't think we can say that if it just has a beginning, then it's a game. Or that if it's got a purpose or motive, then it's a game. Yeah? Some of the most horrifying and clearly unfun and ungame-like activities have all of these. Again, divorce has all of these, and it's super not at all a game. Yeah? If you're playing it as a game, you're doing it wrong. Yeah? So, we've got the evidence from, so here's a couple of arguments. We've got the long-term failure of philosophy to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions for some of the most important ideas, despite humongous amounts of effort. We've got the failure of dictionary definitions, which if my whole job was coming up with definitions, like people work for the dictionary companies, their whole job is coming up with definitions, and they can't do chair in a way that actually gets all the chairs and excludes all the non-chairs. And we tried it with game, we didn't come up with anything. So here's 3 lines of argument for maybe most of the definitions that we deal with are more like family resemblances than sets of necessary and sufficient conditions. So now that I've taken great pains to prove to you that definitions don't have necessary and sufficient conditions, let's go ahead and pretend that they do have that, because that's the way people act. Anyway. Not really, but let's go through 3 types of definition. Actually, so whether a definition has necessary and sufficient conditions depends a lot on what type of definition you're talking about. So let's go through these 3 types, essentialist, stipulative, and reportive. So go through these one by one. An essentialist definition, the meaning of the term is set in some sense by nature itself. So people use the word water for a really long time. There's been words for it in every language. And then we found out that water is H2O. There might have been questions about whether something counts as water for millennia, but then we figured out what it really is. In some sense, that H2O, having two hydrogens and an oxygen, replaced any intuitive definition that we might have and becomes sort of the real definition of water. Yeah? So this is an essentialist definition. You might get these from math and geometry. You might get them from some of the more precise sciences. They're kind of rare, but they do exist. And here, I mean, you really do get necessary and sufficient conditions here. If something's got two hydrogens bonded to an oxygen and nothing else, that's water, baby. And there's just nothing, I mean, if it doesn't have that, then it's not water. The end, right? So all this weird stuff I did about games kind of doesn't apply to things like water or copper or uranium, right? Like, you see, if it's got a certain number of protons and neutrons, that's uranium, end of story, right? So sometimes we do get really nice, crisp definitions, and sometimes they are, in some sense, set by nature itself, and we discover these definitions. So we discovered that water's got this as its essential structure. Yeah? So there's a kind of essence of water. That's what Plato and Socrates were after, the essences of things. And justice and knowledge and truth and beauty, maybe those don't have essences, but water, turns out it does. So good. Okay, let's talk about stipulative definitions. So in some contexts, you might want to just decide what the definition is going to be. So, you say, in this context, by this word, I will mean, blah, 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 blah. So, for example, in this class, I said, argument refers to a conclusion and at least one premise offered in support of it. It doesn't just mean a premise or just a conclusion or a fight between two people, despite the fact that people use the word argument like that all the time. So I'm forcing you to use the word argument in a way that I have stipulated. Is that the real meaning of argument? I don't know. That's not really what's important here. The important thing is I've stipulated a definition for that word. I've said, I want you to use this word in this way. So people do this all the time in philosophy. They do it sometimes in law. The nice thing about stipulative definitions is you can't be wrong. Say, okay, for the purposes of this class, I would like you all to call this an apple. And you might think that's a silly thing to do, but if you're stipulating a definition, in some sense, you just can't be mistaken about it. Yeah? So that's nice. So we might do this, again, we do this in philosophy all the time. You say, look, for the purposes of this conversation, because most of our concepts have these weird fuzzy boundaries and we don't really know how to define them, but suppose you need a precise definition, you say, okay, look, for this conversation, what we mean by this is this. You can see why that'd be useful, hopefully, in law, for example. So what's the definition of a house? You go to the dictionary, it's going to give you some vague thing, but in the legal context, you need some really clear, like, look, if it's got these things, then it's a house, and if it doesn't, then it's not. So you stipulate a definition. Say, the legal definition of a house is this and this and this. If it's got those properties, we're going to treat it as a house. And it doesn't have to match up with how people actually use that word when it's a stipulative definition. So that's nice. So you can get, once again, you can get necessary and sufficient conditions if you're stipulating definitions, because it's sort of not trying to capture how everybody uses the word, just saying, here it is, here's my definition, and we're going to work with that for the purposes of this conversation. Yeah? So another type of definition in which you might genuinely get necessary and sufficient conditions. Now, that's not usually what people are thinking of when they think of definitions. Usually, they're thinking of what we call the reportive definition. So the reportive definition is what we were trying to do with the game example and the chair example. We were trying to come up with some definition that captures the way people use the word. So you could have offered a stipulative definition of a game. Say, look, here's what we mean by game. It's got rules and players and it's fun and there's a competition. The end. And anything that has that, we're going to call it a game. And anything that doesn't have that, it's not a game. But that wouldn't capture most of the ways that people use the word. So when you're writing a dictionary definition, what you're trying to do is, report on people how people actually use the word in practice. And this is where it gets tricky. This is where it's very hard to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions because people just use words all kinds of ways. And usually it's a mess how they use the word. So yeah, a smorgasbord is a buffet with many small dishes or a diverse collection of things. So this is an attempt to, like, when people say, what is a smorgasbord? They mean, mostly they use that in there's a bunch of small dishes, right? And they're not stipulating, and nobody, like, we didn't discover a smorgasbord in nature, right? That's not like a scientific discovery. Look, a wonderful array of small dishes. That's not how that worked, right? People use that word to refer to certain things, and the definition is trying to capture their use. So the essentialist definition provided by nature, the reportive definition we sort of impose on the world. The reportive definition, we try to capture how people use a word in practice. And this is messy. This is genuinely messy. So here's I love this diagram for trying to illustrate the messiness of reportive definition. So how do people use these words? And these are different probability words. So these are almost certainly, highly likely, likely, about even, improbable, unlikely. And these are perceptions of what these words mean. So they asked a whole bunch of people. They did a survey and said, okay, when I say likely, what percentage probability do you think that corresponds to? If you say something's likely, does that mean it's 50% probable or 75 or 80 or 90, something like that? Almost certainly seems to correspond to something between 90 and 100. Almost everybody agrees it's somewhere between 90 and 100. So notice at least two things about this. Notice one, that these are not like points, right? It's not that everybody agrees on what probability things correspond to. These curves are a little bit spread out. So there's differences in how people perceive these words. But they're also not completely flat, right? So it's not that people are just completely evenly spread out across these things. There's kind of clusters. So nobody thinks almost certainly corresponds to 10% probability. Although there seems to be one person here who thinks highly likely corresponds to 20%. Although anytime you do a survey, there's a certain number of people that just answer bizarre things. So yeah, there's undoubtedly going to be outliers. I used to do student surveys, and I put one question in that would say, answer C if you're actually reading this. And I'd get about 5% people answering something other than C. So there's some of these that are fairly tightly clustered, and there's some that are really spread out, like we doubt or improbable. Improbable goes all the way from 70 to 0%. So the nice thing about probability concepts is you can put a number on it. So you can say, what do you think this word means? And you can compare the numbers that people produce. And people produce semi-clustered numbers, but they're not the same, and they're not just completely random. Yeah? So people are using these words, and they probably think that everybody else is using them in the same way that they are. So if I tell you, well, it's highly unlikely, you might think that means 10%, and I might think it means 30%. And we usually don't sort of check the exact meanings that we have in our heads. So if you're doing a reportive definition of if you're doing a reportive definition of probably not, you have to include this whole area under the curve as part of the use that people are making of these terms. Yeah? So, all right, so reportive definitions can go wrong in at least in the following three ways. They can be too narrow, they can be too broad, or they can be both too broad and too narrow. So let's go through some examples. So something is too broad if it's too inclusive. Remember, the job of a definition is to draw a circle in the world. And inside the circle is supposed to be all the members. Outside the circle is supposed to be all the non-members. So a chair is a piece of furniture meant for sitting on. Includes too much stuff, right? It includes all the chairs, I take it, except that one weird chair in your aunt's front hallway that's covered in plastic. It's the not for sitting chair. So mostly chairs are meant for sitting on, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff that's also meant for sitting on, right? A bench is meant for sitting on, a sofa, like a log around the fireplace, around a fire pit. Those are all meant for sitting on. Maybe the log isn't a piece of furniture, but we've included too much stuff. So if this is the scope of the definition, it's much bigger than the actual uses of the word. So when you if you did a survey of all the ways that people use the word chair, that would be the green circle on the inside, and the scope of the definition includes all that stuff and way too much as well. So it's too broad of a definition. Yeah? Okay. And of course, if you have too broad of a definition, you can make bad inferences. So a typewriter is a means of writing. There's a definition for you. It's far too broad because lots of things are means of writing but are not typewriters. So you all have means of writing, I take it. Therefore, you all have typewriters. Okay. Another way that this can go wrong, a definition could be too narrow. It can include not enough stuff. So a school is an institution that aims at teaching children how to read and write. And there are definitely schools like that, but there are also schools that are not like that. For example, this school. You are neither children nor are we trying to teach you to read and write. Well, maybe we're trying to teach you to be better at reading and writing, but you got the basics, right? And you're not children. So you could have a ballet school, you could have an art school, so on and so on. I take it that those are types of school. So this definition captures some of the things we mean by school, but there's a whole bunch that the circle's been drawn too narrowly, right? It's too small of a circle. It's leaving out a bunch of stuff that should count as schools. And, okay, so yeah, I don't know how helpful these are. A farm is a place where vegetables are grown. This farm only raises chickens, therefore chickens are kind of vegetable. Okay, that's terrible. Okay, and finally, you can have both. You can be both too broad and too narrow. That is, you can include things that you should be excluding, and at the same time, exclude things you should be including. So hockey is a game played on ice in Canada. So what does that leave out that it should include? I've actually heard that they play hockey in other countries. Unbelievably, I know. I don't know who let them, but they're doing it. Okay, and then what does this include that it should exclude? What's a game that's played on ice in Canada that's not hockey? Yeah. Lacrosse? No, usually it's on grass. If you're really hardcore, you can play it on ice. Just shout it out, Curling is another game. Does anybody have an example other than curling? Figure skating, yeah. Is that really a game? Okay, let's not do that. Okay, yeah. Okay, so this definition, it excludes hockey elsewhere in the world, so it's too narrow, and it includes curling and figure skating, which it shouldn't, because those are different than hockey. Yeah? So it's both too narrow and too broad at the same time. And the goal, of course, is to try to get it just right. You don't want to include all the cases, not exclude anything that's a case, and not include anything that's not a case, but you can go wrong in either direction or both at once. And if that argument that I gave you before the break was right, you're almost always going to go wrong. And you're probably going to go wrong in both directions, right? You're going to include some things that don't count, and you're going to exclude some things that don't count or that should count. It's going to be tricky to get these circles drawn perfectly. But, okay, so quick practice. So are these too broad, too narrow, or both? So a Supreme Court is the highest court in Canada. Is that too, what is that? Yeah.
Oh, that's too narrow because there are Supreme Courts in other countries.
Right, right. There are Supreme Courts of other countries. Is it too broad? Does it include anything that it shouldn't? I don't think so. I think it's just too narrow. Yeah.
Does it include any court that's physically higher?
Good. An ambiguity. Yes, potentially. Good. Okay. Poetry is an art form that uses words to convey images and ideas. Yeah.
Too broad?
Too broad. What does it include that it should not include? It's got things lumped into poetry that shouldn't be lumped in there.
Uses words to convey. I don't.
Like writing a novel. Yeah, sorry, I stole your. Yeah, so this includes not writing a novel. I take it there's a difference between a novel and a poem, right? Yeah? Okay, a bungalow is a one-story building. Bungalow is an old word. I don't know if that's even in, it might not even be in your vocabulary, but yeah.
That's too broad and too narrow.
Too broad and too narrow. Because I'm gonna force you to come up with examples. So okay.
It's too broad and too narrow because like an apart like there's like townhomes and stuff that are one floor and it's not really a bungalow.
Right, right.
And, like different stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. Or like a strip mall is usually one
One floor.
one floor, but it's not a bungalow because a bungalow's
It's complex.
yeah, it's supposed to be a home. So that's including things that it shouldn't be including. Is it too? So that's too broad. Is it too narrow somehow? I don't know if it's too narrow.
Not too broad.
Okay, so it's just too broad. Good. Okay, so that's the too broad, too narrow game. Yeah.
But is a bungalow always a building? Because a bungalow can also just be the bottom part of a person's apartment.
Really?
Yes.
Oh,
If you go on Kijiji now, they include bungalows as the bottom part of a house or the bottom part of someone else's condo or something.
huh. Okay, so
Could be too narrow.
since we're doing reportive definitions, we don't get to be like, no, you're wrong. We have to be like, oh, that's how people are using the word. So that's part of the reportive definition now. Yeah, yeah, good. Yeah.
I don't totally know what bungalow is. I was really,
It's a very old word. Yeah.
yeah, sorry.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's fine. It's good. Thank you. So good feedback on whether this is a worthwhile example.
Many houses in Peterborough are bungalows.
Many
It's like old style.
Right. It's like an old style one-story house kind of thing. Yeah. Like they built a whole bunch of them just after World War II, like slamming out these little one-story houses. Okay. Good. Okay, that's probably it for today. Definitely show up on Wednesday because we're going to have a test. So we'll see you there.